I have a lot to share with you, but first I want to thank Bill for all the support over the years, and also especially thank Ray. Ray was the first person from Monterey I met at a conference in Almaty, probably in 1990s, back in those days, and he's been an unstinting colleague. He shared an enormous amount with me, and actually a lot of this book wouldn't have been possible without Ray's help. I hope I can reciprocate.
The royalties, perhaps.
But really, there are very few places in the country that I'm happier to be. There's just not enough attention paid to education and nonproliferation and in intelligence and disarmament. So despite the weather and the sort of odd thing of driving to Monterey in a pouring rainstorm, I just couldn't even look out the window for the Castroville and try and catch some artichoke fields. It was really a nightmare. But I want to focus today on just a small part of what's in this book. The book is a sort of big sprawling story that begins with the war scare, the period of tension between at the peak of the Cold War in 1983 and runs all the way through really 1997-98. And it was deliberate choice on my part to try and span the last years of the Cold War in the period that followed. I felt that a lot of the literature always seemed to stop either in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down or in 1991 when the Union collapsed. And one of my major theses is that if the Soviet Union was what it was, a certain kind of a system which did some really absurd and odd things with weapons, that the people who designed them and built them and deployed them may have gone away as a political system in 1991, but the weapons and the materials that they were built of and the people who designed them lived on. And I try to look at this as a single period in the book. As often happens when you're trying to write a history, you want to know how did that come about, so you take a step backwards. And if you look at my work in 1998 when I was in Russia and writing about these issues, over a decade I kept trying to step back a little bit, where did that weapon come from, where did that idea come from. As a result, 2/3 of this book transpires chronologically before 1991 and the last third after. I hope that they're all equally as interesting, but I plead guilty to a little bit of structural imbalance, because as I dug deeper and deeper into the earlier period, asking my question about the invention of things and the use of science and technology to improve these weapons, I got more fascinated with them. I also got really wrapped up into the subject one day when I was a Moscow bureau chief, and frequently visitors from the United States would come to my office. We had a couple of nice soft chairs ready, a cup of tea and cookies, and oftentimes people I'd never met. So one day a fellow came who was a contractor for the Department of Energy. I never met him, but he called ahead. I said, please come by, I'd like to hear what you're doing. And his job was to go to a lot of the fissile material sites that had been identified in the 1990s and make sure that the portal monitors and the video cameras and all the methods that we had paid a lot of money for in non-Luger and CTR were properly installed and working. He was an inspector. This was 1998. It was a rather grim time in Moscow because you remember the ruble crashed, the banks were closed, people weren't being paid, and restaurants that are all sort of a symbol of the new Moscow had closed, and people were rather sullen. It was also, after the ruble crashed in August, it was probably, I would say November. It was getting pretty cold out because the fellow arrived with a big coat. He was a heavy-set guy, very big as a linebacker, really, and he told me how he had been in an institute that very day, and it was so cold that even he was shivering. And the institute was the Institute of Theoretical and Experimental Physics. It's a beautiful institute in the middle of Moscow on 89 acres, and it was a research institute, and in the research institute were a large number of 6-inch long aluminum-clad containers containing highly enriched uranium. I'm not allowed to say how many containers, but there were dozens of them, and that's why we had put in all the portal monitors and all the protections, the guard, the perimeter had been improved, and that's why this fellow was visiting. Here he comes now. To check to make sure that nobody made off with any canisters of highly enriched uranium. My friend had been given a cash advance from the Department of Energy for his trip. As many of you who have traveled know, he got a per diem. So he had a bulging wallet of the per diem he received from the Department of Energy. But when he got to to the Institute and looked around, he discovered that something had gone wrong that nobody had thought of. This is, I remind you, 1998, not 1991. Yes, the cameras were in place. Yes, the portal monitors and the perimeter fences were there. The locks were there. But all the guards, all the people to run them, had walked off the job because they hadn't been paid, because the ruble collapsed. And my friend immediately went back to his hotel room, sent a cable to Washington, which I later saw in the research for my book, saying, the human factor is cracking. The uranium was vulnerable. The guards have walked off the job. Time is of the essence. He went back the next day. He got all 32 people he could find in the entire institute together in the deputy director's office. I imagine it was a little bit like this. He told me it was still so cold, he was shaken to his bones by how cold it was, no heat. He took all the money out of his pocket that he'd been given for his per diem, and he put it on the table and he said, will you stay here for 2 more months if I pay you this money until I can get back and figure out how we're going to keep guards? Again, I have long believed and thought and read that proliferation was a hypothetical problem. I read a lot of the pieces that have been written over the years that what if this, what if that. And when this fellow, his name was Eric England, came to visit me and told me this story about how he put his per diem on the table to pay guards, I had an insight that proliferation was not a hypothetical in Russia in 1998. And this was the origins of the book. I began digging around deeper, trying to find out how much more of the chaos that I saw all around me was for real. And it took 10 years of research off and on to produce this story. And I hope that if you're interested in BW and fissile material, especially, those two subjects are treated exhaustively in the book. There's not as much CW, but I hope that all of you that are interested in these things will find my research at least helpful to you as you try and understand what happened in this period before and after the collapse of the Union. I'm not going to give my talk today on so much on this period, but I wanted to introduce that subject because a lot of the book was inspired by that idea, and I devote a lot of time to it. But instead, I'm going to tell you about a series of new sheaves of information, really, a large cache of documents that allows us to reevaluate Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev as the leader of the Soviet Union and as one of the agents of change in slowing the arms race. I think this is important. It's stepping back a little further, but it's important because many of us have already pretty well-formed ideas of what Gorbachev's role was and what he did and how he did it. But in the process of my research for this book, I found a lot of information that both improved my assessment of Gorbachev's role and cast doubt on it. Now, because I don't have a huge amount of time, I'm going to give you a capsule summary of what improved my thinking about Gorbachev, and I'm going to dwell a little bit on something that I think is a black hole in his record, and I think you'll hopefully find this relevant to today as well. Why do we care? Gorbachev was a figure, a statesman really of the century. His contributions to ending the Cold War are extraordinarily important, but much of what we know, think, and understand about Gorbachev was from our perspective. Books that are written about this time are relatively triumphalist. American literature about this says that Reagan won the Cold War, SDI, bankrupted the Soviet Union, and I think one of my strongest conclusions was that somebody needs to understand better what really happened on the Soviet side of these events. And it's made difficult, not only because of our desire to declare that the United States was the agent of change and the victor and all of that, but also because the Soviet system didn't really set itself up to provide a lot of transparency to us about what they were saying to each other. In fact, as you know, the Soviet system was very closed. It produced a lot of spin, what we might pejoratively call propaganda. It constantly shielded the inner deliberations, and it's been very hard even for historians to get a sense of what was really going on. So I got lucky. In my research, I found this cache of documents, this large amount of material, which were the papers of a fellow named Vitaly Katayev. Katayev is a name I'm going to use more often in this talk because he worked in the Central Committee on the staff in a department called the Defense Department, once previously called Defense Industry Department. It was the part of the Central Committee that was overseeing the military-industrial complex. A pretty good place for a professional staff member to be. Mr. Kitaev was a rocket and aviation designer by training. He was brought to the Central Committee as a specialist in 1974, and he served there almost every day until the day the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. He kept an extraordinary amount of very careful records, technical records, tables, flight test data. He accumulated key decision documents. He essentially tried to keep track of a lot of stuff that was going on around him for many years. Some of it from the 70s, I haven't looked closely yet, but I did look pretty closely at some of the material from the 1980s. And just to give you a sense of what these notebooks and papers are like, I brought something you can pass around to you. There's a picture of Kitaev taken in the 90s. But you'll see just in the handwriting here and in the drawings how extraordinarily sort of careful this guy was. And if you can imagine somebody in the Kremlin making these notes and then us having them for study, you can begin to appreciate how important, I think, some of this material is. I will stipulate it's fragmentary. If somebody looked in your desk drawer, what would they find? You know, drafts, third drafts, fourth drafts, things that were passed around and never acted on. It's not a complete archival set. It's actually what was in the man's drawer. He took it all home when the Soviet Union collapsed. And it's now all deposited at the Hoover Institution archives, where half of it is now available, and the other half will be available early next year for scholars to study. Why is this so important? Because, as I said, if we want to understand the history of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev and his actions as a leader in arms control, in breaking the speeding locomotive, as he put it, of the arms race, we need a better perspective of what went on inside. So the good news part of my story, the short one, is going to be the Kitaev documents and the other research I did paint a new and more complex picture of the pressures that Gorbachev was under in responding to Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. I like this example because so much of the American mythology is the missile defense was this great giant machine that sort of blew away the Soviet Union. And my argument in the book is that's not true. The Soviet Union imploded of many other reasons. But what's really interesting is that what we see from the documents and my interviews is that the Gorbachev struggle internally was far more difficult for him and just far more excruciating than we understood. And the big piece of evidence in this is that Kitaev records the complete size, scope, and details of a colossal plan to build a Soviet Star Wars, which was brought to Gorbachev in the first months that he became General Secretary. And if you can imagine, at that time, the guy's just come in. He had been part of the leadership, but he's still consolidating his control. And he comes in, and next thing he knows, all these famous designers and constructors and people in the military space field are bringing him a plan which was going to cost billions and billions of rubles to build their own Star Wars. And Gorbachev's main contribution, I think, as a leader was not necessarily ideology or even tactics, because he was sometimes kind of sloppy, but he was always maneuvering. He knew at that time he couldn't just say no to these powerful guys, but he didn't say yes. And I describe in the book what he did to essentially let this entire plan collapse of its own weight. He never put any of it really into action. In the next few years, it begins to fall apart. And you see in this process what I would say is sort of the upside of the Gorbachev experience in slowing the arms race, which is, had he been a son of Andropov and Suslov, had he been orthodox and absolutely part of the continuum of the previous system, he might have built this thing. Brezhnev certainly would have built it. Brezhnev loved those guys when they came in, and he would have said yes. So I've truncated this story a great deal. Certainly going to answer a lot of questions about it. It's told in great detail in the book, but just so, let's stipulate that this is one side of Gorbachev that comes to light from this large amount of new documents showing that he stood up not only to the generals, that he not only began the retreat from Europe, that he not only canceled weapons systems, but he also did not say yes to the next stage in the arms race, which would have been militarization of space, as he called it, which would have been building a Soviet Star Wars. So I've kept this short because I want to get to the second part, and that is biological weapons. The Kitaev documents open our eyes a fair amount to a new chapter, a new understanding about the Soviet biological weapons program. They are not scientific documents, and they're not bench science, or they're not the 30 volumes of formulations that exist somewhere of all the things that the Soviet scientists did. Instead, they are fragmentary but fascinating documents about how biological weapons issues were dealt with at the senior levels of the Soviet leadership. So I remind you that the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, signed in 72, takes effect in 1975. Soviet Union was one of the original participants. You know, prohibiting production and use of biological weapons, no enforcement mechanism, and starting even before the ink is dry, and certainly soon after, the Soviet leaders start a very large, very secret program to create their own biological weapons. I'm not going to go through all the details. Ray knows acres more than I do about it, but what's interesting and what to me is, what did Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, these great paragons of glasnost and perestroika and ending the arms race, what did they know? And when did they know it? And we begin to get some glimpses now from the new documents that have come out. Again, just to remind you, Ken Alabek, one of the fellows who defected from the system, has claimed in his memoir that Gorbachev signed a 1986 5-year plan, February 1986, 5-year plan for the BW program. Alabek says he saw it. One or two other people I interviewed say they've seen it. I've never seen it. Furthermore, we found some evidence in the Kitaev records, in summaries of actions by the Central Committee, which I think Gorbachev should have known about if he didn't, that started in 1986 on biological weapons. But some point in 1987, there begins to be a real high-level worry, and this is why. Shevardnadze shot the biological weapons guys in the foot a little bit. He went to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and as a gesture of glasnost and of the new thinking, Shevardnadze announced that the Soviet Union would support a very tough verification measure that was being considered as part of the Chemical Weapons Convention under negotiation at the time, and that was mandatory challenge inspections without right of refusal. I remind you, the BWC had no such verification, but this became a consensus by 1989 in the CWC. Shevardnadze endorsed it in a speech in August of '87. If you recall, Gorbachev was quite forthright about wanting to take down and get rid of chemical weapons. But as soon as Shevardnadze did this, or soon thereafter, the secret biological weapons leaders began to worry. Because if these inspections could be carried out under the CWC, and they didn't know when the treaty would take effect, but somebody could point to a BW facility. And what were they going to do? Stand in front of the door and say, no, we only have BW here? They couldn't do that. So there are some signs then that they begin to get worried about what they call foreign inspectors. And again, at first this puzzled me because there were no foreign inspectors on biological weapons, but the CWC implementation of that worried them even before the treaty was signed. July 27th, 1989. Reagan's already left office. There's a new American president. All the top leaders of the biological weapons program meet in the office of a Politburo member, Lev Zykov. He was the Politburo guy for the military-industrial complex. The meeting was at 6 p.m. How do I know that? Because I've seen the attendance sheet with the red names checked off. And all the top people are there, including Kalinin, the head of Biopreparat, Yevstigneyev, the head of the military's 15th Main Directorate, Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, Khrushchev, the head of the KGB, and his predecessor, Cheprikov, Moseyev, the chief of the general staff, and Akhromeyev, the Sergei Akromeyev, who was at that point an advisor to Gorbachev, was listed, but he didn't come. Why is this important? Because the discussion at this meeting was, oh my God, what do we do about inspections? When are the foreign inspectors coming? And they essentially had decided to grope with this problem by creating a few places where foreign inspectors could come and they could show off as being clean. It was, forgive the cliche, but a Potemkin village kind of solution to the challenge. It was still bubbling up a little bit in July of 1989. Nobody knew when they would be actually challenged, but Kataev, thankfully, made some pretty careful notes of this meeting. He attended, he dated it, he put down, cross-correlated the participants with the ones that were on the agenda. And we get some fragments, which I talk about in the book, of what kind of discussion they had about how to get ready in case they were asked about their illegal biological weapons program. Well, as you recall, and by the way, as a result of that, there's a Central Committee resolution on biological weapons in October. It's 1989. Does Gorbachev not know about a Central Committee resolution? I think he does. Weeks later, a big break happens. One of the top officials of the biological program defects, Vladimir Pasechnik. Pasechnik defects to Britain, and he begins to talk, and he begins to spin out the details. And I wrote a chapter to this in the book, but suffice it to say, this was a big breakthrough for all the people in the various arms control communities who had doubted whether or not there was a program or how big it was. Pasechnik's revelations begin to really change the thinking, and it became clear in the West that there was such a program. And, you know, there was a little bit of panic in Moscow when this happened, but it didn't grip them right away, because we see in their own records that, you know, the Berlin Wall fell in early November, and in December, President Bush and Gorbachev meet at Malta. In the Malta summit, I've looked at all the records. There's no discussion at all of biological weapons. Now, you can imagine why. If you were a policymaker then, Germany is now, and its future is now up in the air. Gorbachev is under fire at home, and his fortunes seem to be worsening. If you're the American president, you know, you want to get a nuclear strategic arms treaty. Do you at that point say, oh, by the way, Mikhail Sergeyevich, I have this other little thing here? And of course, if that had gotten out at the time, Jesse Helms was still Foreign Relations Committee, and you can imagine it might have been a really terrible thing to explain. Gorbachev, already known globally for new thinking, glasnost and perestroika, how would have he explained it? And Bush, seeing his agenda already late, already tenuous. So they essentially mutually decide, I guess, not to say anything. It was kept very secret, and all top White House aides were told not to let it out because they didn't want members of Congress to throw this up in their face. Again, in January, this is not something that was happening at a very tiny, disappearing level in the bureaucracy. First days of January, there's a collision in the highest levels between the Foreign Ministry and the Defense Ministry over a very minor suggestion by Shevardnadze that if they're asked about biological weapons, that they maybe should propose to the Americans that they would explain something about biological weapons they had before 1975, which would have been legal, and perhaps explain how some of them were converted to peaceful uses. A rather innocuous suggestion, but it was also tied at the time with questions about this anthrax outbreak at Sverdlovsk in 1979, which the Soviets had never satisfactorily answered. So one of Shevardnadze's deputies circulated 15 copies of a Central Committee resolution with this innocuous suggestion. And again, I remind you, this is all new information to us. We've never seen inside the system how it operated like this before. But what was amazing to me was that Shevardnadze's proposal was met immediately, within days, with a very strong negative reaction from the Defense Ministry. And they said, there was no accident in Sverdlovsk. We cannot exchange information with the Americans. Forget it. And they went around and they essentially collected all 15 copies of that document and they burned it. So, you know, Pasechnik is already in Britain talking about the program. The world has filtered over to the United States. You know, Gorbachev and Bush have decided not to talk about it. Things, you know, they're not stable. The Politburo decides then, in April, and again, at a high level, we have to think about some way to answer the Americans when they start asking us about this. So they came up with an idea, and they issued an instruction that the Americans, if they ask, we should try to propose some very nice sounding confidence building measures, and perhaps have an exchange of visits to each other's biological weapons facilities. Well, I remind you that we abandoned biological weapons in 1969 and renounced them in toxins shortly thereafter. And we didn't have an offensive biological weapons program, and they had a huge one. So this was kind of, in my view, part of the continuing cover-up. But you can see how it might have sounded appealing to diplomats. You know, if you were a negotiator and someone said, well, I got the Soviets to agree to an exchange of visits, maybe that would be what they call it deliverable. But looking at the way the policy was made from inside, it looks more like a cover-up. Shortly after that, a few weeks later, again in 1990, Gorbachev's situation worsening at home, the American ambassador Jack Matlock and the British ambassador Roderick Braithwaite took a formal, detailed démarche to the Kremlin and the Foreign Ministry. This document is pretty much an indictment of everything that was in this biopreparat program. It wasn't perfect, but it was based on a lot of consensus discussions, and they took it to Anatoly Chernayev, who was one of Gorbachev's top aides. They also took it to Alexander Besmertnik, who was the deputy foreign minister. They read him the Riot Act. The very next day, the memo, which is in Kitaev's records, shows that Gorbachev asked for, and he received the next day, a report from Zykov about biological weapons. So the reason this is important is that this is the first document, the first time that we actually see a report to Gorbachev in his name directly about biological weapons. Now, it's 1990 compared to 1986 when those first records came out, but this one is for real. And there was a little tiny post-it note, so to speak, a little piece of paper at the top saying, also for Edward Shevardnadze, for your eyes only, top secret, and so on. Now, this part is really top secret. I don't think we have any choice but to keep going, so believe me, I have no PowerPoint, you're not missing anything. And in this letter, Zykov spells out some aspects of the Soviet biological weapons program for Gorbachev in 1990. But he doesn't tell him the whole truth. And it's so typical of the Soviet system that Zykov would lie to his president, but that's essentially what happened, by omission and by shading things. And you know, just one little example of this, at the very opening of the letter, he says that by the time the convention was signed in 1972, the Americans had commissioned 10 biological recipes or formulations developed in special research centers, and also 35 types of munitions for using these substances. But of course, we had abandoned them by 1969. But this suggestion to Gorbachev was, well, the Americans are doing it, so it justifies us doing it. And he says the Americans were trying to work on biological weapons through third countries. They were doing it in a deceptive way, so we had to respond and have our own program. And he tells Gorbachev that we carried out such work only until 1989, which was also born. Anyway, a couple days later, just a couple days later, Secretary of State Baker is in Moscow for a ministerial, and he's riding to Zagorsk, this old town, to see the monastery on kind of a outing with Shevardnadze. They're alone, except for translators, in the limousine. Baker gave Shevardnadze in the limousine an unmarked, a non-paper, a white paper listing the concerns about biological weapons. Now remember, they'd given the démarche a few days earlier. Zykov has now written to Gorbachev, at least raising this on paper. Baker's in the limo, and he gives this thing, and Shevardnadze says to him, in the present tense, he didn't think it could be so, but he'd check it out. Well, this guy had already spent more than a year in the high-level meetings about the cover-up, so. A few weeks later, Gorbachev comes to Camp David to see President Bush. They had a summit, Washington, Camp David. Gorbachev told me that at that walk they had in the woods at Camp David when they discussed biological weapons. He and Bush each said to each other, well, your guys accuse you, you accuse me. So what did they talk about? Let's have an exchange of visits. In July, Baker gave Shevardnadze another paper saying, here's what we believe you have, you must answer this. And remember, we're coming up now on a year since Pasechnik began spilling the beans. So there's a flurry in the foreign ministry. They decide they have to answer Baker. Shevardnadze and Baker were going to meet at Irkutsk on August 1st. A little bit of boating on Lake Baikal, a ministerial in Irkutsk. And thankfully, Kitaev has kept these records as well. And it's quite interesting because in this particular moment, he kept everything. The draft talking points, the formal, actual typewritten talking points, the agendas. And basically the foreign ministry prepares a series of short little sort of cards for Shevardnadze for what he's supposed to tell Baker. And what's written on there is, Shevardnadze said, we have no biological weapons. But how about we have an exchange of visits? The cover-up continued. All during the autumn, they negotiated an exchange of visits. If you recall, this was a terrible time for Gorbachev. He won the Nobel Prize, but the hardliners moved in. Shevardnadze resigns. And that exchange of visits actually happened with the first American-British visit to Moscow in January. And, you know, the history of that's pretty well told. I tell it again in the book. Basically, the folks who went trained eyes and going there in secret. Alibek staged essentially a cover-up the whole time, but they saw through it. They saw the size of the aerosol test things. They saw the fermenters. They saw the number of people working there. They saw the size of the facilities. And, of course, they came back with even more doubts. The exchange of visits had not allayed anybody's concern. They had even more doubts. And the demarches continued. And Baker, in early 1991, Gorbachev last year, again asks what's going on. Gorbachev says, well, we have to have our guys go visit your country now. Again, I remind you, we didn't have any biological weapons, but they spent a year insisting on that they had to come see ours. That exchange actually happened. The Soviet officials came right after the coup and before Christmas, 1991. There's a wonderful picture of all these top guys who were part of their biological weapons research system coming here. Of course, we had no biological weapons. They didn't find any, but they were determined to say that they had. And the discouragement over this is one of the reasons why Alibek left. He was on that mission, and he saw how cynical they were. This chronology raises a really important question. Gorbachev, of course, his narrative ends in 1991. I won't go on into the later period when the struggle continued, but about Gorbachev. In all of his struggle for disarmament, his determination to push back the military and its powerful designers that I mentioned before, his willingness to abandon the doctrine of two blocks inexorably at odds, his rhetoric about a world free of nuclear destruction and danger. This was a big unexplained gap. The biological weapons drive was going at full speed at the same moment that Gorbachev reached the apex of his cooperation with Reagan. Gorbachev abhorred nuclear weapons, declared his intention to eliminate chemical weapons. Did he also fear the pathogens? So what's the answer? I asked Gorbachev. He quickly told me in a sort of confused way that he thought there was very little difference between offense and defense in biological weapons. You know, it's a thin line. We all know that to be true, but that's not an answer. Then he changed the subject and wouldn't talk about it anymore. But I think there are several possible answers, and I will tell you sort of what my research showed, and then I'll finish and take your questions. First of all, I find it very hard to believe he didn't know. At least by 1990, we have documentary evidence he did know, but he, you know, Central Committee resolutions, it'd be pretty hard to believe the General Secretary just had no knowledge of that. Chernayev insisted to me and in his memoirs that Gorbachev wanted to end the biological weapons program, but the military misled him, that they told him they were doing it or that they didn't tell him the truth. I don't know if that's true or not. We also don't know, what did the KGB tell Gorbachev? Did he really believe that the Americans had a biological weapons program, or we had just hidden it better? And if Gorbachev knew of the Soviet program, why didn't he take stronger action to stop it? And this is really the big unknown, because I think he had to know. But there are we can come up with some speculative answers. One might be that he realized that the thing was so entrenched that it would have been impossible for him to push back. It may have been that he made a tactical calculation, essentially, that he had done so much and had so much else to do that this would be impossible or would blow up all the other things he had tried to do. It may also be that he just felt unable to challenge the guys who were running this thing. We saw in the Chernobyl, in the details of how he reacted to Chernobyl, how angry he was at the nuclear priesthood and the way they had hidden the problem from him and the way they had reacted to it. A third answer that is sometimes was given to me by Soviet officials was that Gorbachev saw the biological weapons program as kind of a military asset, or as they would say, a reserve program, something to keep extra if they got to nuclear disarmament, some extra edge the Soviet Union would have. I don't buy that argument, because I don't think that was Gorbachev's temperament and mentality. I think he really did want to disarm, and if he could, he would have gotten rid of it, but he didn't. So I'm going to end here. I've just opened to you a sample of my findings in this book, a new way to kind of look at the history of an important period, and I hope it stimulates some questions. I hope you enjoy it when you read it, and please fire away.
Thanks very much, David. Why don't we collect some questions and then try to respond. Tina, you want to just identify yourself for everyone, and then we'll pick up some other questions. I see Yelena also.
Christina Hensel, I'm a director, NIS Nonproliferation Studies. And so I'm very curious. I think that it's a very interesting talk that you gave, and I'm going to have to dig more into those Kataev notes because I've read a few, but there's so much to read through them. But I'm curious what you think of the contention by people like Yevstagniev, who has said, he wrote a couple of papers, one that I edited, so went back and forth with him about the bio program. According to him, he says it's a defensive program, and part of the question is, how did they conceive of what a weapon is? And his argument is, we would have seen a fully, in his view, offensive program if it weren't for Gorbachev at the end of the Cold War, and the step he says they never took was the production to make munitions and doctrine. How would they use these weapons? So he contends that they got very far toward that, but didn't take a final step. So I wonder, do you have any feeling that they really thought it, or what makes you think that that's wrong, or what would you say?
See, I think you raise a very good question, and the real question is sort of a twilight zone. Where is the known period of what we know, the empirical evidence of what we know they did end, and then there's some gray zone, and then there's things we don't know. Okay, I think if you take the known set of things, we saw at Stepnogorsk a factory to manufacture tons of anthrax, 10,000 liter fermenters. That's real, Mr. Yevstagniev. I mean, don't tell me that you haven't decided when you built a factory to produce enough anthrax to wipe out the entire Earth, right? Ditto, Pokrov. Why are there thousands of incubators in a nuclear-hardened bunker? I mean, just the evidence everywhere. The milling machine at Ultrapure to, take pathogens and make them so that they will be successfully distributed in a weapon. We know those are all hard facts that we know about. I have never seen any of the purported hardware weapons or munitions that were part of this thing, because in many ways we just never got to that knowledge. There was talk that they were working on aerosolization that was supposed to be effective at an altitude of 200 feet from a fast-moving cruise missile, perhaps, a line sort, I don't know. What is the mechanism? There's been speculation in books, which I don't repeat in my book because I couldn't prove it, that there was an ICBM with coolant system on them. No one's ever seen it, and I think some of that information may be wrong or so highly speculative as not to be useful. And so first of all, I would say to Yevstagniev, I don't trust him, first of all, because he was part of the system. He was part of the cover-ups repeatedly. But the fact is that you can see enough in the research and development of pathogens, in the second step, the ultra-pure step of preparing them for distribution, and in some of the production facilities, Burt's, Stepnogorsk, of a war mobilization machine. Now, nobody thought that biological weapons were a first strike weapon. War mobilization took 28 days, right, or 30 days. But you don't build Stepnogorsk just for research purposes. And I think that's, Yevstugnev participated in the 1992 Wisner meetings. He participated in a lot of the cover-up things. And to say there's no doctrine, to me, doesn't mean a lot in this case, because there was no doctrine for other things as well. They did things because they could do them. I hope that's not a complete answer, but I just would break it down to what do we really know they did, what might they have done by people's testimony, and what don't we know.
Thanks, David. You think I have you next?
I have kind of a comment and a question related to it. Generally speaking, that whole weapons program with the Soviet Union and the U.S.-Russian kind of approach dealing with it is one more time proves that a verification mechanism is very important. The fact that the Soviets couldn't check on what's going on in the U.S. or other countries played a lot to the development of that sort of theory. So they didn't know, they couldn't trust. And believe me, to this day, I hear once in a while, we had some visitors here, that to this day, they suspect that U.S. defense bio program is much more advanced.
Right, and they point to Kenya and Thailand, and also, to support your statement, the meeting I mentioned in 1989, to me is fascinating, right? A prospective verification measure that actually didn't take effect for 4 more years has already got them thinking about how to react to it, whereas they've been going for 14 years previously, deliberately violating a treaty that they knew had no verification. I agree with you, trust but verify, it's very important.
So the fact that the U.S. once again blocked the verification mechanism plays again to the fears over there. So I'm not suggesting they're going to back to the program, that the U.S. is doing something. So it plays to the fears of other countries. First, but second point that I want to make is that this whole going back and forth with the visits to each other facilities, I think it still flags the CTR-related projects related to the bioweapons program in the Soviet Union, in Russia. First of all, the fact that the U.S. didn't allow to visit some of the facilities to this day still cripples down the progress in working with the Russians on this mountain, the bioweapons program. That's again to that first verification and trust, and second reciprocity. They were really, from what I understand, sure that the U.S. has the program as well. So the fact that there were some visits, but not all that they wanted to see to this day, actually. So that there is some guilt to be put on the U.S. side as well. The progress could have been much bigger into the dismantlement of the Soviet biological weapons program if there was a little bit more done on both sides. But I don't know whether you've had some discussions with the U.S. side on that. Why there was no reciprocity?
I have not, but I agree with you. There are other factors as well. Aside from our lack of reciprocity, another thing that happened, I report in the book that Aldrich Ames gave the Russians in 1993 a secret national intelligence estimate that was the summary of everything that we knew about their BW program. It was completed in October. And when the Russians received this, they concluded that actually our people were spying, and that people we were sending over for doing non-Luger or CPR were all spies. It raised their paranoia remarkably and shut the program down for a couple of years.
I think I have Patricia then, Ray. By the way, I want to encourage, there's quite a few students here as well, so I would be delighted for you to ask questions. This is not just for our senior staff. Patricia?
Thanks very much. I'm Patricia Lewis, I'm the Deputy Director here. I wanted to just follow on from what Elena was saying. A friend of mine was in the Soviet bioweapons program, a scientist, and he came over to the United States with the Alibek inspection. And he and a number of colleagues went back and were absolutely furious with their political masters for having tricked them. It was clear to them that the
Right.
US had absolutely no
Right. And this way I'll
bioweapons
make sense too.
capability
Yeah.
because they had been working on a bioweapons capability.
Right.
And he's very, very straightforward about that. There's no twilight zone to him. He knew what he was doing.
Right.
And he believed he was doing it as a quid pro quo, a form of
Right.
deterrence, and that he believed in what he was doing as part of the security of the Soviet Union and had pride in it.
Right.
And then when he discovered this, he was so upset and so angry. And you know, a number of them went on hunger strikes, and he was one of those. And they wouldn't release him from his duties until there were letters coming in from scientists all over the world demanding that they be released. I don't know if you've interviewed these people. They're amazing scientists. But when they
I've
realised
interviewed
that-
some, but I don't think I've interviewed this person. I didn't know about the hunger strike. I did know about the anger.
Yeah.
That's why when I saw the picture of them on the actual inspection, Rakov and Sandakhchiev and Alibek, they're all standing shoulder to shoulder. I'm thinking, this was that December visit was quite.
They were emotionally devastated.
Yeah.
And many of them have then gone on to work, for example, in UNSCOM, UNLAVEC, and back to other parts of what then broke, when the Soviet Union broke up, there are other countries to work on these issues.
Right.
So it leads me then to the issue of verification. And one of the things that happened as a result of what happened in the Soviet Union then got fed into the whole UNSCOM in Iraq. And what we now understand, and it's not 100%, but what we understand, particularly from Charles Dolfer's work, is that Saddam Hussein was so frightened of the inspection, which feeds into these discussions that you also heard in the Soviet Union, that in sometime around April 1991, they poured all their anthrax away. And we never knew that. We never believed it. And in fact, the original inspectors, as you know, were quite skeptical that Iraq had a serious bioweapons program. Then they discovered that they did have, and then they never discovered how they got rid of it, and we're still looking for the pieces of paper. And there's a whole story there that I don't want to go into. But that then fed into the discussions in Geneva on the Bioweapons Convention and in the end, the destruction of what would have been a verification regime for the Bioweapons Convention. So my contention is, and my question to you is, can we re-look at that? Can we look at that again and learn these lessons about how we might verify, not with perhaps a high degree of certainty, but with some degree of certainty, and perhaps with enough certainty that might have a form of deterrence against cheating in a bioweapons convention. Look at it again with fresh eyes from what we know.
Yeah, let's tell you, I'm not a legal expert, and I've tried to read some of the debates over the BWC, and I would hope so. I'm not the expert, but I'll leave it to the experts. They didn't do a very good job the last time because Bush basically blew it up. Maybe we should try again.
Well, it was a terrible protocol. I need to go back and look at it with a completely new set of eyes. But knowing what we know now, I think it would be worth trying.
Great.
Okay, Ray Zelenskis, I head the Chemical and Biological Weapons Nonproliferation Program here. I'm wondering about the churning of the coin by the Putin administration. After all, under Yeltsin, he actually owed up that they had an illegal offensive program. They made declarations to that effect for a few years, one at least. And Yeltsin quite frankly said that they lied to me, and he ordered the shutting down of the system, the illegal system that had violated the Biological Weapons Convention. Okay, so all of that is pretty much on the record. In comes the Putin government, and now they change. Now they say, we never had an offensive program. It was only a defensive program. And by the way, the Sverdlovsk 1979 outbreak, that was a natural accident, or it might have been caused by American saboteurs. That's another story that they have. And now they stick to that. So why? I don't understand exactly, and nobody probably knows exactly what goes on in reason, but why do you think it's important to the Putin administration to, shall we say, set the record straight, which is of course the lie part, the legend part, and instead of saying, oh, that was in Soviet times, we don't have to worry about it, they did some terrible things, let's move to the future. Instead, they lie about this whole thing.
I agree with your description, maybe I would add something very important. And that is that when Yeltsin fessed up, I described this in some detail in the book, when he fessed up in 1992, he repeatedly told John Major, he told George Bush, we know he fessed up. He created a commission, they did issue an incomplete declaration to the UN, but it was the first. But I believe the fact pattern of 1992 shows that the generals subverted Yeltsin, and that they were continuing to try to keep parts of the operation going. They tried to ignore him, they tried to block him, and that's why when Frank Wisner came in August of 1992, Yeltsin's first year, Yeltsin had already fessed up, and then Wisner comes over because we had a defector who said, it's still going on, they're going to try and weaponize this antibiotic-resistant plague, they're doing it at ultra-pure. And who's in the room, by the way, when Wisner reads this indictment? We've all seen it. It's a very specific, again, you know, and Yevstagneyev is in the room. So it goes on. They make another inspection, right? We have another visit to ultra-pure. Again, everything is covered up. I would just add that, yes, you can say Yeltsin was open and he had done these things, but frankly, he didn't get control of this. And maybe that's a clue about Gorbachev's assessment of how hard it would have been. Maybe Gorbachev realized he couldn't. Yeltsin didn't either, and it was all partly his fault because he put the guy in charge of that commission, Kuntsevich, who was one of the old guard, and Yevstagneyev as the deputy. He put the foxes right in charge of the hen house, and so by the end of 92 and early 93, when this is going on, I would just modify the chronology. Yes, Yeltsin made an effort to crack open the door, but like the one in 1990 with Shevardnadze, it got slammed shut. And then, of course, things go dark after Ames betrays all the intelligence. They go dark for several years. And when Putin comes in, I think it's a part of the continuum. Putin represents the mindset of security services that were pushed out of the way in Yeltsin's time and came back. And they are protecting the same program that they protected in 1992 at that meeting with Wisner. It's basically a continuum of people. Why have those three laboratories, the military BW laboratories, never been open? It's part of a continuum. And if they say they have no offensive program, then why are those laboratories closed? Why is the anti-plague system in Russia still closed if they have no offensive program? So my response would be, don't look at the Yeltsin thing as the norm, but look at it as the exception.
Thanks. Some other questions for Mr. Hoffman. Tempted to call upon one of our South African diplomats to get a comparative perspective here. So I want to put you on the spot here, John.
You have with it. Yeah, it's interesting. South Africa, as many would probably know, had some slightly covert biological weapons programs that were subsequently shut down, and we've tried to play a more constructive role in the BWC, particularly since in developing the protocol, which is being re-looked at now. I don't know what more to say.
Well, I just wanted to say that one of the things that you might learn from the South Africa experience that might have an impact here is that the protection of individuals. There were individuals who were involved in the South African bioagents program, I'd rather call it than BW program, because it was never actually weaponized. And it became then a criminal program, which ended up selling drugs on the street and stuff. And it was just completely out of control, and it was very few people. But the South African government, one of the reasons why there's so much suspicion still is the South African government kept on covering up some of the history, and they still don't like it talked about, as I know to my cost, because of protections of certain individuals who they do not want to be prosecuted under international law, or they don't want to be targeted as revenge because there were some nasty things done, a la Bulgarian sort of.
It's so quaint, you know, because the Russians, they don't care at all. Yevstagneyev, I went to visit him. Here's the guy who's head of the 15th Main Director, right, the main BW branch of the military. And I go to visit him, I got an interview with him in 2005, And the interview was held at the offices of something called Biopreparat, which is a private company. And it is in exactly the same building, number 44A, Samuel Street, where Biopreparat, the secret operation, was, in the same building where Alabek and Kalinin had their arguments. And they have fancy brochures. We're now a private company. Look at all the pharmaceuticals we're making. And as Ray, I was told by him in that interview, and as Ray mentioned, that Sverdlovsk was not an accident from the military. It was sabotaged by the CIA and by security services. And this is 2005. So I would say to you is that in the Russia case, I don't sense that anybody's all that worried about protecting individuals. They just make them private entrepreneurs.
Could you, oh, you want to follow up? Okay, first, let me have Nikolai and Juliana, husband and wife team.
Well, you yield the floor.
Yeah, just,
Well, okay, wanted to switch gear to the nuclear stuff. I don't know whether you had a chance to interview any of the individuals who are currently working on the CPR-related programs of the nuclear security issues in Russia. Because most of the programs are kind of ending their life cycle, and some of the funding is going to disappear pretty soon in terms of the support for the CTR installed systems, upgrades at the Russian facilities. And whether you had any conversations with the Russians when U.S. Contractors and government officials were working on it, what is the sense, particularly given the now financial situation, how reliable is how we can sleep safely in terms of the upgrades and security of the Russian society?
It's a really good question. I'm not the expert on it. I wouldn't venture. I have had some conversations like you, but nothing definitive. I worry about the lack of transparency. I certainly think Russia has enough money to devote to these things. It's not the basket case country it was in 1991. And look at the fissile material storage facility we built for them. $300 million. I know there are excuses for why it's only 25% full, but it still strikes me as an important question we ought to keep asking. There's a lot of work yet to be done, and many people, when I wrote my earlier book, The Oligarchs, about that tumultuous period in the transition to capitalism, when Putin came in, he vanquished some of the oligarchs. Everybody was cheering, and they said this will be good for nuclear security because we have a strong man in again. He won't let any stuff leak out. Everybody wanted to paint the Yeltsin period as total chaos. I don't disagree with that entirely. I thought it was freedom in chaos, but it was a chaotic freedom. But I warned at the time, and I feel like I've been vindicated, that Putin's KGB methods of closure, of denial, of lack of transparency were going to hurt CPR efforts, because if it's not transparent, if it's black, then you don't know what's going on.
if I can follow up on Yelena's point, and I'll go on Nikolai. I happen to have traveled as part of the National Academy Sciences team to many of these sites with Eric England, actually earlier in the fall of 1998. And there are multiple sides to the story. You treat him, or you characterized him as in heroic terms, which I think
It's an anecdote.
No, I'm leading someplace here. I don't disagree with that, interpretation. He indeed became himself exceptionally frustrated in terms of engaging parties in Washington to invest more in doing what he thought was absolutely essential, and basically was purged. He was removed from the DOE system. So I think, I tended to share his alarmist perspective at that particular moment in time. But it's also the case that there were many people who were not prepared on the U.S. side, I think, to engage in the fashion that he thought was urgent at that particular moment. So I haven't read the book yet, and I don't know how you treat Eric, but he was a very interesting and complex character.
Well, this extent it was extra bonus, it's not actually in the book,
Oh, it's not in the book.
but it does appear in another case.
Oh, okay, okay. Nikolai, you had a,
Yes, thank you. I'm very sorry. I just came back from Moscow and I'm still jet lagged, and so if I stutter more than usual. First of all, I want to support what Patricia has just said about people who work like on these programs, not actually. Well, it's actually believing that the United States was engaged in a weapons program and things like that. And just an example from the nuclear field, which I know much better. A couple of years ago, I had a chance to meet with one guy from the nuclear weapons lab in Russia. And we chatted, and it turned out that the lab was operating on the assumption that the United States was developing new types of nuclear weapons. And that was several years after Congress actually shut down like RW, advanced concept initiatives and things like that. So I was really struck by the fact that they did not know the status like of the weapons programs in this country. Yes, so I just like could just come and tell them and like give them the facts. Yes, and that guy was quite interested, but then so it turned out that the bosses did not, in fact, allow such a briefing. Apparently, the system actually wanted nuclear designers to operate under the assumption that the United States was still engaged in such programs. So there seems to be like a wall there that separates the scientists and designers from knowledge about the other side. Yes, and the point about Kataev's paper that you circulated, well, of course, Kataev is extremely knowledgeable, and I'm very reluctant to question that. But I actually think that in the 12th five-year plan funding for defense programs was actually more, about double. Than what Kataev said there, and I also did not see a couple of other.
Yeah, this D20 this was D20. This was just part of the Soviet SDI.
Okay, okay.
There were actually two parts.
Maybe that's why.
That's
yes,
what
there were some other programs, and interesting actually fact that if you take the total on R&D funding for strategic programs, or like in general, defense programs actually consumed more than 50% of the total. In fact, more money was spent on defensive programs than on offensive programs, and that's quite, I think, interesting and curious.
And I would just like to agree with your first point. And in 1983, 6 Harvard professors wrote a very good little book about nuclear war and the problems of it. And I quote this in my book. They observed in 1983, the United States cannot predict Soviet behavior because it has too little information about what goes on inside the Soviet Union. The Soviets cannot predict American behavior because they have too much information.
Too much is I don't actually believe you. But okay.
David, we focus on a number of episodes here, but I think it's going to be interesting for you to about, how one goes about researching, obviously very, very sensitive topics, and you had, an extraordinary range of context because of your, tenure in Moscow as the bureau chief. But you also know that you've been able to go back and to conduct interviews. And could you say just a little bit about the process of writing this kind of a book? I mean, is this something that only you could have written, or I mean, what made it possible really for you to obtain the kind of materials that give such power to the?
I did have the advantage. The Washington Post sent me to Moscow in 1995. Gave me a year beforehand. I prepared at St. Anthony's in Oxford. So I studied the language carefully. The paper gave me a lot of time. In 1998, I devoted the entire year to writing about this issue, mostly what I called then legacy issues. Early warning, nuclear, chemical, biological legacy issues. I went in that year to Penza, and I found an abandoned chemical weapons dump outside the stockpile walls where they had just dumped lewisite-filled shells in the earth, and then the spring thaw had heaved some of them up. No vegetation growing nearby. I went to the Yenisei River, and at a little village called Bolshoi-Balchug, I explored the bits of plutonium from broken fuel that had been, carried 300 kilometers down that river. So I did a lot of 1998. Things were still relatively open. Met a lot of people. Did a lot of what journalists could do in Moscow in that time. I think today would be much, much harder. But I think the period, certainly from my arrival in '95 through '99, through Yeltsin's late years, I benefited enormously from this openness. I knew and interviewed Igor Sutyagin, and one day he gets hauled off to jail. I visited some of these institutes which have now been completely closed down. And the Putin years really changed the nature of this kind of work. I continued to go back generally once a year on research trips all the way through up to last year to do the research for this, but I had a lot of what I needed. I also realized when I saw the Kataev material that it would be extremely sensitive. None of it was in an official government archive. It was in private hands, and it's now at Hoover, so you can look at it freely. So this was not research. This was research that was available to me, but was not yet fully declassified yet. Furthermore, I think that one other thing I would say about this is that there's a thing about the nature of chaos in a collapsing system like this that oftentimes doesn't work to your advantage and sometimes does. And year 2005, I asked for permission to go to Snezhinsk, to Arzamas, and to Obolensk. And my request to visit the two nuclear weapons laboratories was considered, went to Rosatom. I had the support of the ISTC. They were going to sponsor. I wanted to talk to scientists and say, what had happened to you since '91? That was a simple request. There's a chapter in here on the scientists. I just wanted to know what had happened, how effective was the ISTC, who did it reach? I had already arrived in Moscow when all the paperwork for my visits to Arzamas and to Chelyabinsk was lost, and I was prohibited from going there. However, I was welcomed at Obolensk, and for 2 days I was allowed to conduct extensive interviews, several hours each, with 7 scientists. Now, why? I mean, I can only guess, but I think in part things were essentially they were more down at the heels at that point. Maybe they had a story to tell. I don't really know, but sometimes if you just ask. I have a friend in government. He says, people make a big deal about SIGINT, signals intelligence, and about the value of humans and human intelligence. But he says there's 2 other kinds that you really ought to pay attention to. Ask int and go int. And that's what journalists do.
Okay.
Well,
Oh, you want to
just add a little to that. Whenever I travel around in the former Soviet Union, I learned very quickly that if you ask, can I take a picture of that? The automatic response is no. Because, if somebody has to then go through the whole process to get permission for me to do that. But if you just take the picture, nobody says anything.
You should talk to Tina and hear some of her stories. what the consequences are for acting in that fashion. And that's another story which we'll talk about offline.
I would like to add too, that as a journalist, I always identified myself openly. I was accredited by the Russian government, I followed their rules. I feel like that was essential to doing, to my integrity as a journalist and writing the book. I didn't do anything that broke the rules.
Well, David, it really is a pleasure to have you here. I'm sorry that the weather was not as accommodating as we might
What do you mean, it forced everybody to come in?
That's right, there's nothing else to do. No, this was really a fascinating seminar. I think many of us look forward to reading your book. And I very much hope that we can attract you back and talk about some of the other things that you found in your, both in the archive and in your own kind of collective
I'll be happy to
experience.
come back. And the book has its own website, which you'll see is on the back cover, thedeadhandbook.com, and it has a contact the author form there. So if after I leave you have questions, you can just go there and write me a message. I'll be happy to answer.
Please join me in thanking us.